Hello and welcome back to another Giant Slayer TFT Synergies tier list video. Today our analysts will be ranking each synergy from S down to the C tier. This week's tier list is going to be more speculative than anything, as there was a hotfix patch that still is having an effect on the meta. So take everything with a grain of salt, as we're still figuring out where the meta is headed. With all that said, let's dive on in. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video, and to start it off, we have the synergies in the S tier. This tier consists of sharpshooters, assassins, vanguard, and mystic. Basically, these are the traits that seem to be doing the best after the hotfix patch. We're seeing these synergies at the top of the meta and often get top 3 placements consistently. First up at the top of the S tier, we have sharpshooters. Sharpshooters were already doing quite well prior to the hotfix, as they were a viable counter to Divine. They weren't always going to win, but they could definitely secure a top 3. After the Divine nerfs, this synergy has truly risen to the top, as we're seeing it destroy the competition, and it seems to have taken the place of Divine as the best trait. There's a few reasons as to why sharpshooters are doing well. First is that they just do a ton of damage, not only to the front line, but due to the ricochet of the trait, they can kill the backline just as quickly. Another reason is that Zeke's Herald was buffed and is a key item for the synergy, as a 40% attack speed buff is amazing for ranged champions. We expect to see this trait continue to do well for the rest of 1021. Next is a potential counter to sharpshooters, assassins. Assassins have really risen up in viability after the nerf of Divine. Even before that, they were doing well, as there's a lot of variations that you can actually play with this trait. Ninja, Assassin, Talon, Enlightened, and Diana Carry are just 3 of the many variations that can do well in the current meta, and they all revolve around the Assassin trait. There's 2 important aspects about Assassins that make them useful in the meta. For starters, they provide a way to get into the backline, which a lot of compositions are currently focused on between sharpshooters, Ari carry, and hunters. The other reason is that with Divine no longer being a threat, the amount of burst damage assassins can output is ridiculously high. We expect to see this meta develop around countering assassins for the remainder of the patch. Moving along, we have Vanguards as the best frontline trait for 1021. Overall, Vanguard has always been useful in set 4 because of Sejuani, but they've really taken center stage after the Divine nerfs, because a good portion of main damage carries have a lot of focus around physical damage. We're talking about sharpshooters, assassins, and hunters, as all of those traits do both physical and magic damage. Vanguards are protected enough to slow down a lot of those compositions from instantly winning the fight, on top of the fact that Sejuani and Aatrox provide amazing crowd control. And the last S tier synergy is Mystic. Mystic, at this point, essentially has an honorary spot in this tier because splashing 2 Mystics is almost always beneficial, and practically every comp does it. The only downside to Mystic is that 4 Mystic is rarely used outside of the Vanguard Mystic Ari comp, but even then, the fact that Splash does a 2-piece trait into so many builds makes it one of the best synergies of the set. Alright, let's move on to the A tier. This tier consists of the synergies Ninja, Elderwood Hunter, Duelist, Exile, Brawler, Adept, Fortune, and Dusk. We're seeing a lot of these traits do well in the meta, but their place in the meta is still a bit unknown. That said, all of them are doing well enough to get top 4 finishes. Ninja is up as a companion trait to Assassin. Akali and Zed are the main carries for this trait, and both do quite well. If you want high burst damage, you go for Akali, or you can lean on more consistent damage with Zed. The main downside to Ninja as a trait was that Divine leaned heavily on playing Adept, which meant Shen was super contested. So with the hotfix, it's now more viable for Ninja players to actually find the Shen, as well as the fact that Divine is no longer a trait. Overall, we expect to see Ninja continue to rise up in popularity and may potentially end up being an S tier synergy. Next is Elderwood. Elderwood may not deserve such high of a placement, but we're speculating that due to the nerfs to Divine and Static Shiv, it may rise up in viability. The reason is that there's significantly less true damage to threaten Elderwoods now, which means they can potentially counter compositions like Sharpshooter or Assassin. Ashe is also still a viable carry, which leads us to our next trait, Hunter. Hunter as a trait actually did quite well into Divine prior to the hotfix. The reason being that Kindred, along with the bonus damage of Hunter, made it possible to kill Warwick early on in the fight. With Divine now being nerfed and less prevalent in the meta, it means Hunter should be used to counter builds with weaker front lines like Sharpshooter. We'll have to wait and see how the meta plays out, but we recommend giving Hunter a try with so many players playing Sharpshooters and Assassins. Duelist is another synergy that's up in the air currently because it did get a bit nerfed with the Divine and Static Shiv changes. The strength of the trait is how quickly it can burn through enemy front lines and the fact that it's not relying on a backline to do well. We're unsure if Duelist will remain as strong for the rest of the patch, but for now it appears to be doing well enough. Exile goes hand in hand with Duelist since Yasuo is the main focus of both traits. Yone is also a viable late game champion to toss in, but Yasuo is going to be the reason that we see Exile being useful. Specifically, it does quite well during Stage 2 and parts of Stage 3, which makes it a great trait to use prior to pivoting into a Duelist-focused mid-game build. Brawler seems to be the weakest of the current frontline options, but it is overall still useful because of Ashe carry. Items are also less focused on countering high health targets, so we may see the rise of Brawlers as players try to counter armor-heavy traits like Vanguard or Elderwood. Adept may fall quite a ways down in the meta as it's primarily been used to help Warwick proc the bonus damage of Shiv. But there's still other comps that use Adept such as Duelist and Ninja Assassin, so it's possible Adept may remain a viable synergy in the meta moving forward. Fortune is in the A tier because it has a lot of potential to do well. If you can make the trait work, it's amazing. The huge upswings of this trait is what actually makes it good, so we recommend giving it a try if you find yourself with an early Fortune chosen champion. Dusk fell down super hard in 1021 because Static Shiv was a straight up counter to Riven since it does true damage to shields. But with Divine and Shiv being nerfed, we're likely to see less of that item and thus the possibility of Dusk compositions goes up significantly. The main issue we see with Riven and Dusk is that she may struggle with the high amount of damage that champions like Jhin or Akali can output. That said, Dusk as a whole is one of the synergies that has the potential to end on a high note for 1021. Time now to move on to the B tier synergies. This consists of Enlightened Cultist, Keeper, Divine, the Boss, Warlord, and Moonlight. Overall, expect to see these synergies at specific points of the game with a focus on niche builds that utilize them. Kicking off the B tier, we have Enlightened. Enlightened is in an interesting spot as there's Talon as a carry and sometimes Nami if you can 3-star her. But this trait requires specific conditions to do well, and Talon leans more into Assassin than he does Enlightened, which lessens the usefulness of the trait. That said, the synergy does have a lot of potential, so keep an eye on it moving forward in the meta. Cultist is still being explored after the significant changes it received in 1021. There's been some players that are managing to use it as a stepping stone to get to level 9 to play a composition of legendaries, while others barely even use it early game. Whether or not Cultist becomes viable in the meta, the current situation points towards it being less than useful. Keeper is still trudging along as a fantastic early game trait for stage 2 and 3. After that, it falls off, so nothing really has changed in regards to utilizing this synergy. Divine. Where will you land in the current meta? Honestly, it may still be a top trait once players focus on using it more, but for now, it's obviously not going to do well. Expect to see Divine mainly used as a 2-piece trait for the time being, but we're anticipating it to rise back up in popularity once the meta figures out how to best utilize it after the nerfs. The Boss, or Set, is still a viable late-game champion to run. He's just not as useful as he has been in the past, especially with Brawlers having fallen a bit out of favor. That said, he's still going to be great as an 8th or 9th champion to add into your board, and as we mentioned earlier, Brawlers may see a spike in popularity as players are now more focused on countering Vanguards and Elderwood frontlines. Warlords have extremely differing opinions in the current meta. Some players think they're great and can do well, while others say they are terrible and should be avoided completely. Since the meta is still being figured out, we can't say just yet whether Warlords are going to do well or not, so we'll just recommend trying them out and seeing how they do for you. And the last trait in the B tier is Moonlight. Moonlight has suffered greatly with the nerfs to Aphelios as they lack a consistent carry to do well. But there may be hope for this synergy as both Diana and Lissandra carry may be viable options. Moonlight may very well move up drastically in the meta as players explore utilizing either Lissandra or Diana. Now onto the last tier of today's video, the C tier. This consists of Shade, Spirit, Mage, Dazzler, Tormented, and Emperor. Overall, these synergies have a place in the meta, but they have much less of an impact than the other synergies. At the top of the C tier, we have Shade. Shade is, well, an amazing trait because of Zed, but it really hasn't had much place in the meta, with the Kayn change and Spirit being less common. We really want to make it clear, though, that Zed with Shade is disgustingly good, but Shade as a whole is not doing that well in the current meta. Since we mentioned them, let's talk about Spirit. The Spirit champions are great between Kindred's burst damage, Ahri's AoE, and Teemo being a part of sharpshooters. But the trait, after being nerfed a few times, isn't having as much of an impact on the meta anymore. Basically, we recommend using Spirit Champions, but don't worry too much about utilizing the trait itself. Mage is another trait that, well, isn't all that necessary. Ari is the main carry for Mage, and she does much better without it. Vigar is the secondary main carry, and he's fallen off in viability, although he may rise back up with Divine being nerfed. The only potential saving grace for mages is the new Nami build with Ludens, but honestly, even then, she cares more about Enlightened than Mage. So Dazzler was actually doing well because of Divine, but now that Divine has been nerfed, well, we'll have to see how Dazzler plays out from here. It has the potential to be a useful trait with Enlightened, and Divine may actually rise back up in popularity. That said, with Divine and Shiv receiving nerfs, the usefulness of Dazzler has fallen drastically. Up next is Tormented, which is basically the Kayn trait. Kayn fell off incredibly hard in the meta because of a bug fix that's changed him immensely. Basically what the change did is he no longer casts his ability when there's no nearby enemies, which sounds good, but has a side effect of making him spin much less during fights. Whether that's also a bug or not, we're unsure, but what we are sure of is that Kayn is far less potent than before. That said, he can still do well, but the chance of him barely doing anything is a bit too high, making him too much of a risk to use. And the last synergy, as usual, is Emperor. We do need to make it clear that Azir as a champion on his own is amazing, but Emperor as a trait really doesn't matter too much because it has no effect on Azir at all. Azir is good with or without his sand guards, which means you really don't notice the Emperor trait whatsoever. And that's all we have for today's tier list video. The meta should settle into a much healthier place with Divine not being the top dog anymore. But we're not sure exactly how the meta is going to play out, so again, take everything here as speculation. Let us know in the comment section below how you believe the meta is going to change after the Divine nerf and which synergies you think will be best moving forward. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.